Today's episode is short and sweet, all about those holiday conversations where some estranged relative comes and asks you what your plans are for next year. So we've got some great tips and tricks and an incredible download for you. So whether you are launching that conversation about taking a gap year with your mom and dad, or if you are just going to be casually having those conversations at parties, take this quick listen and download the resources because you just may need it. Happy holidays. Welcome to the Gap Year Podcast, where we explore the who, what, where, when, and why of gap years. It's real people sharing their stories, ideas, and experts diving deep into how you can make the right decisions in order to have a meaningful gap year. This is the place to be no matter where you are on your gap year journey. I'm Michelle Dittmer, your resident gap year expert. Let's jump right in. Hey there, and welcome to the Gap Year Podcast. My name is Michelle Dittmer, and I am your host and Gap Year expert. We are well into December now, and whether Santa Claus is coming, or you finished lighting the menorah, or you're getting ready for Kwanzaa, winter solstice, whatever you're celebrating this time of year, we are entering the season of holiday gatherings. And we haven't seen each other for a while, and right now, especially in the middle of a pandemic, we don't have a ton of really exciting things to talk about. And quite often when we get into these situations, we're going to default to some of the safe topics. The weather and what's going on in sports and all of those basic things. And when grown-ups or adults are talking to anybody who is in school, they default to those school questions that you've probably heard year after year from grandma. How's school going? Who's your favorite teacher? What subjects do you like best? And now that you're in grade 12 and in that decision-making phase, you're probably going to get those questions. What are your plans for next year? Those questions are going to start to come up more and more often, whether that's in your virtual meetups or in your face-to-face stuff, whatever you're doing this holiday season. So for people who are pursuing kind of the typical route after graduating grade 12, they'll usually talk about maybe the schools that they're looking at or different programs that they might be interested in. But for those of you who are considering a gap year, sometimes this question can be really anxiety-inducing, something that may put you on edge a little bit, and it's stressful for a couple of reasons. Really, what it boils down to is that we really love other people's approval, and we like to avoid certain areas of conflict, especially in public settings or with people that are acquaintances rather than close people. You don't want to get into really challenging conversations with them. So that can be a little bit stressful there. So sometimes that gap year conversation kind of pins you as somebody who's a little too out there, or somebody who's looking into this, whose family doesn't do gap years. Really, we have this fear of judgment, that we're going to be judged for saying that we are taking a gap year. It's also stressful because we don't want to raise unnecessary flags. So if a gap year is only one of a couple options for you, maybe you're still undecided and you don't want to actually freak anybody out until you've made your final decisions, sometimes this question can make us trip over our words a little bit as we're searching for the right thing to say in this situation. Sometimes if you are committed to taking a gap year, you can just be exhausted from continually having to explain what a gap year is, or even rationalize why you're taking a gap year. Those things can be exhausting, and sometimes it's easier to just avoid the conversation altogether. And lastly, it can be stress inducing because maybe you haven't had those really critical conversations with those closest to you, maybe your parents or your siblings, and you really don't want this to come back to them in a weird way through some second cousin or some aunt you only see once a year. You want to have that conversation first with them, and you haven't had it quite yet. So understandably so, that can be a really, really challenging question to answer in these social situations. So let me give you some options to help you through those conversations. So the first option that you have is to go completely under the radar. There's no reason, you don't owe it to these people. You are not coming up with a life plan that you have to be solidified to. So just fly under the radar. They just don't know what else to talk to. So give them something to keep the conversation going. The more that you can fly under the radar, the better off you are sometimes. So you can either blow off the question altogether and just say, you know what, like, I haven't decided yet. How about this punch? Or look at it's snowing outside. So it's the good old kind of avert their attention and distract them with something else and just completely go under the radar there and send the conversation in a different direction. The more that you're in control of the conversation, the less you're going to have to talk about school plans. So have a quick brainstorm of the different topics that you could talk about that are beyond the weather. Maybe shows you're interested in, things you've read recently, what your friends are up to, some of the latest trends, maybe something funny that happened to you this year, or a new hobby you've taken up, or your job. So have that in your back pocket so that when that does come up, you can divert them to another topic that you're a little bit more excited to talk about. The second road that you can take is actually maybe to seek advice. So somebody comes and says, what are your plans for next year? Give them an opportunity to talk about themselves, and just say, you know what, like, I'm not sure. How did you decide what you wanted to do after high school? Put the ball back in their court. Let them be the ones that are talking through this. You can gain some really neat insight from other people's experiences. Or you can even flip it to get some advice from them. So maybe when they say, what are your plans for next year? You can say, I'm not sure, but based on what you know of me, do you have any suggestions or anything you think I should be looking at? It just can be so interesting to hear other people's stories and perspectives and even their opinions or observations about you. They can be really good data points in your decision making. The last thing that you can do, or one of the other things you could do, is leading with a question. So somebody comes at you, what are your plans after graduation? You can turn around and just say, have you heard of a gap year? And depending on their answer, you can choose how to proceed in the conversation, maybe starting with a basic definition and do a little bit of education for them. Or you can jump into sharing some of the things that you've been thinking about doing on your gap year, whether that is starting a business or doing some traveling or taking some courses, or maybe even just having some time to de-stress and relax. I think all of those things are really great things that you can do in this conversation. So if you are confident that you're taking a gap year and you have a couple ideas, again, you don't owe these people anything. You are not signing a contract that this is what you're going to be doing. This is just where your head's at the moment. So take off some of that pressure. And if you are comfortable, by all means, jump in and have that conversation. So let me give you a little pro tip here. The pro tip would be to be prepared for any follow-up questions, because so often when you are doing something interesting, people want to dig a little deeper. So be prepared if you are going to use the word gap year, if you are talking about doing something that's a little bit alternative, people are going to come back with follow-up questions. So just have a little think on some of these questions, because they could come back with maybe some questions that are steeped in judgment. Maybe, well, why on earth would you consider doing that? Or maybe I also have heard, aren't you smart enough to go to university? Do you not think you're going to get in somewhere? Which of course is not true. We already know that. We've covered that many times in this podcast. And other people saying, well, aren't you scared you're never going to go back to school or forget how to be a student if you stop? And then the last one that you may hear coming firing back at you, do your parents support this? So from the judgmental perspective, just be prepared for some of those questions. They're not condemning you. They don't think it's a bad idea. They're just curious, and this is outside of their normal. So they want to learn more about your world by asking these questions. They might also come at you with some questions of interest if they're really curious. Well, what would you do if you weren't in school? What are the things you're thinking of doing on your gap year? Or they might provide you with some unsolicited ideas or advice. Oh, if I was going to do that, this is what I would do. Or this is what I wish my kid would do if they took a gap year. They might also project onto you. They might really applaud your boldness for taking this pathway and say, oh, I always wish I had done that. Or if I could do my life over, I would 100% take a gap year. And I've often heard a lot of parents say, oh, would you talk to my son? I wish he would take a gap year. Or my daughter, I wish she would take a gap year. Or they should have done that. Now that they're older, I know they should have done that. So be prepared for other people to really want to chime in there and share some of their lived experience too, because it is a very exciting thing to be involved in. The fundamental key to having conversations over the holidays is really to be prepared, and not prepared with a script or prepared with a bullet list that you're going to whip out of your back pocket. This is more about just thinking ahead of time. How would you handle some of the questions that I've named in this podcast? And just have a little think on that so that you're not caught off guard and you don't feel awkward having these conversations. So just have a little think on that. We also have a really great download, actually, and it's all about having conversations about the idea of taking a gap year with your parents. Because speaking of which, over the holidays, we have a lot more quality family time at home, and sometimes these conversations come up, or this could be a really good time to have this conversation with your parents and approach them. And if it's something you're thinking of, whether you think they're going to be on board or you think they're going to be resistant, this can be a really good time to have that conversation before the stakes are really, really high. So bringing it up with them and having that conversation can be really great. Now, I will also say, though, you may be surprised when you approach them. If you think they are going to be very resistant to the idea, I would say at least 50% of the time, the parents are actually supportive of the idea. So don't just completely discount it. If you think this is something that's of interest to you, grab the download and approach that conversation, because you never know what your parents are going to say. So last year I actually did a whole podcast episode on this topic, and it's all about talking to your parents. So you should definitely check out that episode as well if you feel like this is going to be something you're going to be up to over the next couple of weeks or whenever you're ready. It really is a quality resource that can be used year round. And it's so good for those initial conversations with your parents, but it's also a really great prep tool for these holiday party conversations as well. So no matter what, I think you should definitely download that resource. It is so valuable. And then if you are considering having that conversation with your parents, we'll link to that podcast in the show notes, so you can check that out as well. So I wanted just to wish you guys the best holiday season, and I hope that you are having an incredible time and that you are gearing up for a very, very happy 2022. I can't believe I'm saying that, but from everybody here at CanGap, happy holidays, and we will be back with tons more episodes just for you to help you on your gap year journey. So no matter where you are at, I hope you keep on adventuring, and we will be chatting soon.